on week 6 of our series of heroic prophets of the Old Testament. We started out with Elijah and what it means to trust God even when things kind of look bleak. And then we moved on to a time when Elijah passed on his prophetic ministry to Elisha, and what it might look like if people saw God embodied in us so much that people would say, hey, I want some of that. And then we moved on to Amos for a couple of weeks. Amos fearlessly passed judgment on the corrupt king of Israel and the people of Israel who let the nation stray so far from God that the corrupt king could actually rise to power in the first place. There's a lot of judgment with Amos. This week, we are going to change channels, and we're going to visit the prophet Hosea. Remember last week when I said Amos is nobody's favorite prophet? Hosea is not much better at all. And it's not, Hosea isn't angry and judgmental like Amos. Hosea just makes you feel kind of uncomfortable, right? Preachers look at the lectionary to see what's coming up ahead of time in the months to come, and they see that Hosea is in the lectionary, and they go, ooh, I think I'll stay in the Gospels for a while. And even when the people in the church are like, yeah, but these gospel messages you've preached over and over and over the last 10 years. You've never preached from the book of Hosea. And I go, yeah. But okay, repetition never hurt anybody. That's okay. I'll find some new way of looking at Jesus teaches the Lord's Prayer to his disciples. It's all good. Let's just keep it vanilla, right? And the problem with Hosea is that we feel uncomfortable about his circumstances. And if we're honest, we feel even more uncomfortable about God calling Hosea into these circumstances in the first place. I mean, how are we supposed to feel about God when the first thing that he says to Hosea is, go take yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom? I mean, what are you supposed to do with this? So many things to unpack before you can even tackle what the passage is about. I guess the best way to approach this book is to ask, okay, why would God call Hosea to marry a wife of whoredom? Again, this is disturbing. And Otis Moss, who is one of the leading scholars on 8th century prophets, says it should be disturbing. What Moss suggests, though, that we do if we want to get the most out of the book of Hosea is to read it alongside the Song of Solomon. Now, that's a book that the lectionary never gives us. And that kind of upsets me because it's Hebrew love poetry. And apparently it's not worthy of consideration by the committee that puts on the lectionary, you know? Or maybe it's because it's filled with some daring word pictures that are about as subtle as a Georgia O'Keeffe painting. I used to do a public speaking workshop for the General Church Youth Leadership, and one of the things that I'd have the kids do is I would have them read passages out of the Song of Solomon, and if they win if they don't blush or giggle. They never won. Never won. So the reason Moss says that the Song of Solomon needs to be read alongside Hosea is that the Song of Solomon compares a healthy, growing, passionate relationship between young lovers preparing for marriage to a healthy, growing, passionate relationship between God and God's people. Hosea, on the other hand, compares the relationship between God and God's people to a relationship that's dysfunctional, that's falling apart. The difference between reading the book of Song of Solomon and Hosea is like the difference between watching a sweet little romantic drama on the Hallmark Channel and the Jerry Springer Show. You know? And here's the thing. The passage that is in front of us this morning that Lemoyne read, it is just the beginning of this story. Because when you work your way through this book, you learn that Hosea's wife Gomer, whose name literally means dead end, continues to be unfaithful. And she's constantly running off with people, and Hosea has to keep going out and bringing her back. In fact, one time, Hosea ended up having to go out and buy her back from somebody. It is so easy to get bogged down in this cringeworthy drama of this book that we miss out on the big picture takeaway, which is dealing with Israel's unfaithfulness. Because it's clear that the reason Hosea was told to marry an unfaithful woman was because Israel, at the time, was not being faithful to God. So what then was going on in Israel that would cause God to take this kind of an extreme action? Well, first of all, Israel was still struggling with worshiping Baal and other Canaanite fertility gods. And this is a big problem. Why? What's the very first of the 10 Commandments? You shall have no other gods before me. Israel couldn't even keep the first commandment. Good grief, how are they supposed to honor the other 9 when they can't even get the first one right? But we're still skirting the issue here. Just because Israel was being unfaithful, how does that justify God calling on a mortal prophet to marry a woman of whoredom? And then to make it even worse is what he names his kids. Their names literally mean no mercy, not my people. And his first kid was named after a ruler who allowed his descendants to worship Baal in the first place. There are so many problems here that make me cringe, along with many others who read this passage. One could say maybe, well, God sent Jesus into the world to experience the worst of humanity's sins. Maybe God just wanted Hosea to feel the sadness and disappointment of being in a relationship with someone who God knew was not going to be faithful to him. I don't know. Again, hey, Otis Moss says this book is supposed to be disturbing. And let me tell you, it sure is disturbing to this 21st century kid right here. I guess it's supposed to prompt God's people, we included, to ask, well then how have I been unfaithful in my covenant with God in the way that Gomer was unfaithful to Hosea? Or to bring it a little closer to home, maybe we should be asking ourselves, what are some of the false gods in our lives that keep us separated from God? You might be thinking, uh-oh, this is where the preacher gets out and stomps on people's toes. He's been doing that a lot lately. I know, but we're talking about the prophets, right? That was their job, is to stomp on people's toes. So just say, ow. It's all good. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. Those are the first 2 commandments. And in the same way that the people of the 8th century BCE Israel had a tough time getting past those 2 commandments, we do also. Now notice how I've been making comparisons between the nation of Israel in the 8th century BCE and our nation here in the 21st century Common Era. That's why these prophetic books are so valuable for the church in all times and in all places. So here's what I think. I think one of the idols that we struggle with in our time and place is the relentless pursuit of material wealth. And I dealt with this in both of the weeks that we studied Amos. But related to that is the pursuit of status, which I mentioned a few weeks ago when I told you that the number one thing that kids said they wanted to be when they grew up was famous. Here's another one. What about our pursuit of technology? And yes, I recognize the hypocrisy of someone wearing an Apple Watch, standing under 60-inch video monitor with a wireless mic on, talking about the relentless pursuit of technology. I recognize this hypocrisy. But I'm talking about a big picture thing here, okay? Let's talk about the big picture. As Michael Crichton once wrote in his 1990 novel Jurassic Park, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. Now remember, Jurassic Park was a science fiction novel about bringing dinosaurs back to life through cloning and DNA splicing. And that was a big thing in the 1990s because that was during a time when scientists were trying to clone a sheep. Anybody remember what the sheep's name was? Dolly. That was 1997. 50 years before that, people were saying just because we can doesn't mean we should about developing atomic weapons. In the 1970s, people were asking the same thing about mechanical organs when scientists were developing that Jarvik 7 artificial heart. And today, people are asking the same thing about trying to build machines that can potentially attain artificial intelligence. We're wrestling with whether to use robots to fight our wars. We're wondering about whether we should pursue synthetic life. We're agonizing over whether we should be able to edit our children's genomes or DNA. And don't get me wrong, I'm not one of these people who's anti-science. I love me some science. It's just that I'm shocked sometimes about how we barge ahead without considering the moral and ethical implications of our technology. Here's another item for us to consider. When did we start placing the value of ideology over the value of relationships? In other words, when did being right become more important than being decent or kind? And of course the answer is, well, as long as recorded history. But again, I'm talking about our time and place for the moment. I don't know about you, but does it seem like people are becoming a lot meaner? Is it just me? Now I get it. We've been mean throughout history. We've been mean throughout our country's history. But it's funny, it's funny to read some of the debates of our founding fathers ages ago, because some of the things they called each other and some of the things they accused each other are just crazy. It's horrible. But for a while there, in our lifetime, it looked like we were making some progress. Maybe we were becoming a little kinder and gentler. But then we started slipping again. And lately, it seems, we want to make sure that we draw our circles very small and with very clear lines concerning who's in and who's out. Whatever happened to talking about issues and finding common ground, even in areas where we disagree? See, I think this fits into the category of worshiping the idol of dogmatism. You might think, oh, come on, Jesse, do you really think dogmatic thinking is an idol? Yes, I do. Because what is the definition of dogmatism? The tendency to lay down principles as incontrovertibly true without considering the evidence or opinions of others. Well, when you frame it that way, yeah. We might even call this the idol of extremism. So on Thursday, when Margaret and Lemoyne and I were eating breakfast and talking about what idols that we're guilty of worshiping, we came up with all sorts of examples. But then we started realizing that a lot of our examples fit into a much bigger category. You shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make for yourself idols are tricky commandments to keep because they both have to do with where our attention is focused. Or maybe I should say they have to do with where our attention is not focused. And that, unfortunately, is on God. It is not focused on God. If our attention was focused on God, if God was our moral compass, none of these idols we struggle with would even be an issue. We'd be able to set aside our egos and actually listen to each other. We would be able to take time to breathe and be silent and listen, really listen to others. We would be able to establish and build relationship with other people and celebrate the divine spark that is in all who are created in the image of God. These things are acts of faithfulness. Like the young lovers in the Song of Solomon, that relationship is healthy. It grows every day. It blooms and blossoms as they get to know each other. And it's very much the opposite of the selfish, desperate, toxic, and painfully codependent relationship that's depicted in Hosea. One leads to peace and stability. The other leads to destruction. And that, I believe, is what Hosea was trying to demonstrate to the northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BC. And ultimately, I believe it's what God is trying to show us through these sacred texts today. The heart of faithfulness starts with our ability to enter into a loving, trusting, growing, healthy relationship with God. Unfaithfulness, on the other hand, inevitably leads to heartbreak and to destruction. God's Word, from the 8th century BC to God's people today in the 21st century.